welcome everyone. Thanks for coming on a Tuesday night. We had to change things around this semester a little bit to accommodate schedules, but I wanted to really thank Hrvoje Njiric for both coming to MIT this semester to teach, but also for agreeing to do a talk in the department. So Hrvoje is joining us from Zagreb, Croatia, and he's taught at the AA and the TU Graz and the University of Toronto, and now here at MIT. He's the founder of Hrvoje Njiric in 1990, and then in 2001, Njiric Arhitekti. And he's been a prolific practitioner in Croatia, and really kind of pioneering and putting forth a position on post-war Croatian architecture and the role of architecture and the potentials of it in that context. He uses interesting terms like affordable utopias and moderate inventions, and he embraces both the visionary and the mundane. His work, though very broad, it has a focus, is in the area of the social and civic, so housing and schools and public spaces. He's been experimenting with typologies, specifically with housing, and these are his words, in the context of upgrading, efficiency, modesty, and everydayness. These words that he used seem quite benign, but I think you'll all see that he embraces contradictions of the high and the low, camp and correctness, with all very much care and wit. So thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe I can start with this very fact that normally or around the world that you get a very, I would say, provisional and I would say excuse introduction. I'm really happy that Mijin took her time to have a closer look in my work and that she makes a kind of introduction that I'm happy with. So thank you very much for that. It's very rare. I really mean it. So I'm really happy about this part. Then I have to thank, first of all, the school for this invitation. So again, this thanks goes to Mijin, but as well as to her, to Nada Tehrani, who proposed my position here. And again, Mijin for her generous support for my stay here. So I'm very happy about that. This lecture is my third lecture in Boston. My first one was almost 10 years ago at Harvard. The next one, thank you very much, in Northeastern University. So I'm very happy that I had the chance to speak here and to share with you a couple of ideas that we elaborate in our office. And I entitled this presentation today, Concepts, in order to share with you ideas. Thanks to the fact that the crisis in Europe works even more harder in Croatia, there is not much work for architects, even less for construction. So we are somehow forced to turn back to the ideas, to the concepts. Do you think it's better? So we are somehow forced to turn back to these ideas and the concepts and somehow to show that the architecture also can, in a certain way, indulge itself also within the realm of thinking. The ideas that I will share with you tonight are all somehow related to my origins that are in Croatia. Here you can see the emblem of Croatia, the historic one, these checkered fields, which somehow transmutes into a more contemporary version of a Croatian flag, which is still a kind of a proposal. Now we have the heraldic one with some sort of history behind it. So the land of contradictions, which somehow starts on the very main square of the city of Zagreb, where I come from, actually a collection of houses from different epochs. It's very rare actually in Europe and I think in the world that you have such a collection of different historic styles on one square, culminating, as you can see, with this modernist sorry, with this modernist tower from the 60s as a kind of a counterpoint to another house, which is actually here on that side. It's a famous building by Peter Behrens, the so-called Elsa Fluid house. So you have this dialogue on these diagonal parts of the square. There's some historical styles, Art Nouveau, Italian rationalism, and things like that, all somehow like entourage of this square. Then, image from a textbook showing a typical, how do they say, growth of Eastern European socialist city, where actually city of Zagreb has been taken as an example, even though rotated, the north is in this direction, with all these ingredients that somehow shape or characterize the typical city. But on a closer look, then you can see that Croatia is everything else but not this typical Eastern Bloc country. Maybe starting from this street, which is called the Street of Proletarian Brigades, and this is a still from a movie by Orson Welles, The Trial, where actually the most of the film exteriors are shot in this street. So for those of you who are interested in this after the World War II modernism can have a look at that. So there are a number of very fine examples, culminating with this one, the building by architect Drago Galic, which is a kind of a, you can say, remake of a famous Unité example, but still a very original in the layout, in a section where instead of duplex there are triplex units with another solution how to use the roof terrace and so on. Next to Zagreb there is another fine city in our country. It's called Split, and actually here you can see the Diocletian's palace from the 1st century. Actually a weekend house for a Roman emperor, which later on became a city and a kind of a numerous resource of inspiration for the architects. You can see the outline of the old Roman palace. You can see the Cardo and Decumanus. You can see the temples and all the constituent parts of the Roman architecture, which somehow gradually transformed itself into the city. So this is a kind of a compendium of knowledge that we are trying to take advantage of in our work, not only in Croatia, but also fine architects such as Herman Herzberger, Aldo van Eyck, and people like that. Even Kenneth Frampton spoke in favor of such structures. In Split, we have also housing, and I'm here to teach the kids about the housing this year. So somehow I think that it's very important to be very specific towards this very difficult theme in architecture. Here we see some modernist skyscrapers or towers from the 60s, which actually are remodeled by the people themselves, adding the air conditioning or drying clothes and things like that. So I think this is a paradigm of a situation of this freedom of choice, the freedom of reinterpretation within the rigid frames of modernism, which somehow characterizes the situation in such cities. Then another feature which is a bit more specific is that the balconies shift, and so does the ownership. There are people who buy the parts of the balconies and extend their ownership to another balcony. So they are very peculiar, yet very inspiring things happening behind these walls. And these ideas, this kind of a freewheeling ownership that is on the move here can also be a kind of a nice source of inspiration for us architects. Also the idea of living and working. So the guy who transformed his garage into a kind of a workplace, okay, kind of a workshop, is another interesting feature in architecture. The situation in war that was raging in the Balkans in the 90s also has its own agenda and its own things that we can recollect or reflect upon that. So, for example, this sort of, from the city of Vukovar, the kind of emergency habitat, the people who do what it takes to somehow survive. And this kind of a ephemeral situation can also be a resource of inspiration, as well as these refugees camps, the house within the house, and things like that, which can be all derived from these tragical images. Or these ideas, a kind of a realm of vents and ducts, a courtyard in one of the palaces in Zagreb. Or this situation here, that this table tennis table is not just for the sports, that it can be used for other purposes. So this idea of a more coded elements, not to forget the little, the little doggy here also taking advantage of the shadow. So this is an idea, also an image which somehow gives you a flavor of how do we work in tourism, trying to make the best out of the existing and also trying to see it from different points of view. Finally, this introduction will be finished by this beer pyramid, an ephemeral structure that stood in Zagreb for a couple of weeks, like a kind of a almost ideal ziggurat made out of these yellow beer boxes, which lit in the night has this magical appearance, but otherwise as a fine example of ready-made. So this is kind of a level of inspiration that we are trying to make, to take advantage of in these latitudes. So I somehow, quite scholarly, even inserted some titles here in order to make this idea closer to you, and somehow as a kind of a memo for the things that follow. So the ideas that are dealing with these issues here will be illustrated with the projects. The first one is, as you can see, there was a big rush of building hypermarkets in Croatia and Slovenia as the countries that came out of the former Yugoslavia with a big economic impetus. And we were asked to do such a hypermarket in the city of Maribor in Slovenia, and actually we started with a kind of a typological reflection on how was it built in the glorious days in the States by the people who pioneered the whole idea of shopping malls and the idea of consumerist culture, and we somehow reiterated this model of a box sitting on an asphalt desert with a few trees planted along them into a kind of a model which we eventually called European model, where we poured the same amount of square foot into the house, into the plot, but then we have we cut out the parts which are used for the car parks. All the car parts are completely glazed. The outer parts which define the perimeter of the house, this is why we call it European, are completely full. And we transpose this landscape on the roof, which is then completely a kind of a green structure, or at least looking green. So this is a process on the very limits of the site. So this is the idea of incision of the car parks and the glazed areas of the whole, then the introduction of the landscape, and finally anchoring the house to the site with 4 large billboards. So this is the roof area. It's actually, the grass is not the real grass, but the one that is used in these sport terrains for football, and the whole image of the house. Actually, the half of the house is the first phase with these billboards, which are really big. And you see the site plan of the whole thing with these constituent elements. And you can see it a bit better from this model. The idea of trash culture, the idea of inspiration from the everyday also has a connection to the travels, to the things and experience that one collects when on the move. So we somehow always try to transpose these ideas into the built reality in a certain way. So there is a certain vicinity between these images, as well as this one. As well as this one. And then again, this idea, this interest in trash, but maybe not the one on the left, but more on the right side, the trash which is somehow packed with a certain meaning. So the preference of these temporary structures, for example, a fantastic scaffolding in the city of Brescia in Italy, or another example of that kind from Paris, or an example from Venice, or again from Venice, or from Paris, or even from these latitudes in Rockefeller Center, or just before demolishing the Deutsche Bank building next to the Ground Zero, just after the events. So this brings us closer to the use of ready-mades in these Baumax project, the hypermarket projects, where we somehow spotted these reflecting panels which you see in the tunnels, and by the continuous traveling from Zagreb to Maribor, it came to my mind that we can use these elements which are actually coming from the family of traffic signage systems, that we can use them and somehow attach them to the facade in order to save the facade that couldn't be done according to our initial design, but somehow we wanted to make it on one hand side kinetic, in order to show that the cars are actually the ones that circle around the house, not the people. So when you look at the house from one side, then you see it red. When you look from the other side, then you see it silver. So by moving, the facade changes, and especially in the night when you lit up the lights, the whole building somehow burns in these two colors. So this is this idea, a comment on the suburban character of the house and the way how the people circulate around it. Another example of the same consumerist scale, and somehow connected to these keywords that I put forward in the beginning, is another project for the McDonald's building in the same city of Maribor. Starting again in Italy with a transcription of one of the walls where the people in a Renaissance time have carved in the list of the prices for the goods that are sold in front of the building. So this idea of immediacy, of projection of these consumerist things on the wall, somehow let our things go on. Then the idea of using the fabrics, the temporary, these semi-translucent structures to achieve certain goals. An example from Barcelona, and the one from Mexico City to have like a kind of a pigeon house, almost like a sort of a Frank Gehry sort of structure, somehow made us closer to the idea. Another example from Mexico made us closer to this idea of this McDonald's building, where we proposed to equip the standard hut with a kind of a basketball court on top, encircled with these metal mesh, and then articulated with these golden arches, the biggest one in the Balkans. And this is how the project started, with this idea of a shack, which also has this movable parts, like a typical shack sort of architecture, and with all these elements which somehow form this iconography. And this is the building, how it has been done. And it Actually, this is a very good question. It was, as always with McDonald's, as with the sandwiches, which has this lifespan of 6 minutes. Afterwards, you have to throw it. So was the same was with the building. It has to be designed in a very short time, even erected in a shorter time. So we didn't get the right time to get the permission from Chicago. It has to be coming from Chicago to let us do this on the roof. So it remained like a kind of a virtual playground, which is really a kind of a tragedy of the project. But later on, our friends from the office called NL Architects used this image to make their basket bar. 2 years after our project, they made a similar project in Holland and even got the Mies van der Rohe prize for that. So this is about this project. Now I will tell you a bit about what we think about urban morphology, domestic culture, and interpreting the suburbia, which somehow connects to these ideas which I have shown you so far, but somehow deals with the ideas or relatively actual ideas about the suburbia, or how we change this dream into something else. Is this American or Croatian dream or any other? This is not the question at the moment, but the idea that we can influence and we can change the situation in relation to suburbia. So the situation is in the outskirts of the city of Zagreb, in a former village which became a part of the city sprawl. We were asked to do a little settlement, you can see it here, and actually in a relatively peaceful setting next to the village church and some other premises. There was a piece of land between two brooks where we were asked to do this settlement. So you see the site, you see the two streams and the road that somehow services the site. And actually we started with this assumption that we have to start with morphological transformation of the model. So we didn't take the standard detached houses, but we started with a semi-detached house. We made some modification, we took some parts away, so from the upper plan, so from the lower plan, we modified the whole structure into something that we finally called rural mat. Rural in terms of the setting, mat in terms of the legacy of the Smithsons, which opted for very compact, very low, very introverted structures. And then you can see also this procedure visualized like this. Then we ended up with a kind of a compact situation of the mats that we articulated like this, where you can see, we call it individual housing in the group, where actually there is a certain collectiveness in terms of usage of these outer spaces, but in the same time a higher level of individuality in terms of accessing their units and the harnessing of private outdoor spaces. So here you can see those 4 mats situated on the site, also taking a part of the cars away from the site in these cheap carports, and with some sort of ambitious landscaping between the houses. Some models, the idea of having these generous balconies and terraces equipped with prefab barbecues. We even designed a barbecue structure, because not being happy with the one that we have on our DIY market. So actually it was produced by a company. You can, if you have interest, you can buy it under Njiric Plus, commercial name in this company. And this is how it was being assembled. So they were planned to be on these terraces of the houses, but in the last moment the client changed his mind, and so we didn't have a chance to put them. We have to finish the house without them. So it is a pity, because somehow they somehow hint the idea of life in a land setting outside the city in a certain way, like a certain lifestyle. So these are the computer renderings of the clusters, which are slightly different, the ones on the street from the ones in the garden, because of the slope of the terrain. What is a carport here becomes the garage, and we have some atria overlooking this zone of the river. So they are slightly modified in terms of use of these plinth part. So this is how it is in a construction. We have these weather sides, which are completely done in aluminium, and the other parts which are done in wood, like a kind of a friendly material that you can touch and you can come closer to that. So, as I said, all the entrances are completely individualized. You have, from this carport, you enter one apartment, the second one, the third one is here, and the fourth one is entered by an atrium on this level, always trying to maintain the visual contact with the center of the village.
Is it market housing?
Yeah. It's I don't know how much it will tell you, but in Croatia we can. It was a boom in housing in after the 2000, and we could construct such houses for 750 euros. It's how much? $1,000, something like that, and we can sell them for. They were sold for 2,200. So it was a big difference between the money that you that you give and the money that you take. So it was really a kind of a golden age for the contractors and developers. Nowadays, the whole market is blocked because there is a crisis in all sectors. So this is not possible anymore. But as I said, this is a kind of a it's not a social housing, but it's a kind of a housing for a middle class, which somehow also is a kind of very rare species in Croatia nowadays. Okay, so now I will tell you something about our idea of architecture as a process and about illegal as a potential. There was a very strange competition about 7 years ago in the city of Zagreb for a cultural center for the Gypsies. And the municipality even designated the spot next to the already existing enclave of Gypsy housing. As you can see, they are a little bit more organized here, a little bit less here. And the more you go to the south, the less organized it is. The city somehow carved the road and supplied the infrastructure later on after the houses have been built. So they managed to find a plot of land where they somehow wanted to make a kind of a social infrastructure for them, and they even made a kind of a public competition for that. So, but alas, and this is the idea how actually the Gypsies construct in a very, I would say, in a very intuitive manner with the materials that they found at hand. And this was this designated part of a land, and this is the structure of the existing Gypsy settlement. But alas, as the Gypsies are in between, not knowing that there was a competition being held, they constructed the houses within the limits of the competition. So there was a big moral dilemma for the architects. Shall we simply follow the rules and behave as if nothing is there, and simply to use the bulldozers to take away all those houses and to make the cultural center for the same people? Or shall we try to see it another way around? So we opted for this amnesty of illegal structures. So we somehow tried to introduce in these interstices a kind of a structure that could somehow mediate between these existing houses, maybe demolishing a couple of them. So we were thinking about this like a band form structure, which has proven to be too narrow and too small for the program. And then we somehow arrived to a kind of a solution of prefab shacks that we can attach to this delineating wall, and to have a kind of difficult hole, if you want to call it like this. So this is the layout of these prefab metal houses that could be attached to this wall, and then continuity towards the rest of the settlement and the houses of the existing houses of the Gypsies. Here you can see that it's an architecture that simply can be ordered and bought and appropriated for a medical center, for the library, for the police station, for a gym, and other functions that were part of the program. That we also introduced some low-tech, sustainable elements like some solar pergolas, but also stressing this yellow zone as a kind of a void that should be colonized by these people, knowing about their habits, knowing about their festivities, that could somehow enter this zone, which is, as I said, equipped with this urban furnishing as well as it would be somewhere else. So we simply leave the stage empty for them to fill them with their happenings, with their rituals, and somehow this final image of this project, like a kind of idea of happiness that could be created with the I would say strict economy of means that would go into a certain direction. Then I would also like to share with you ideas about programmatic instability. Even though in Croatia almost everything is unstable, so are the programs. Contextuality in general, and popular versus representational. To illustrate this, I will use another competition project, a competition that we won back into 2008, as far as I can remember. It is a campus of city of Split. This is the place where I normally teach, in this house. And this campus is somehow also a continuation of this diagonal development, so it has to be continued. And the very specific feature of this is that it is inclined. It is slightly inclined, so this part is much lower than this part above. So this line is a kind of a progressing line of stairs. And this is a position of a new faculty of law. And this was the competition for this program. But before we actually started to develop the project, we somehow wanted to have a bigger picture how to save the whole structure from a certain frivolity that were on the move. And we somehow equipped the whole campus with a green band of structures which are either illegally built in these areas, which are somehow adjusted with new little towers, which are the students' accommodation, and with extensive greenery, like a kind of a protective intermediate zone between the faculties and the rest of the city. Also introducing this spine, and this is the position of our competition proposal. The house with 3 courtyards that somehow has a certain self-protectivity inscribed into his gene map. So you see the whole structure. And again, in developing this project, we also somehow took as a point of departure the Diocletian's palace. You can see one of the walls with all these, if you want to call them wounds, I would call them alterations that took place along the centuries, and that somehow clearly testify that the power of the structure is actually giving such a freedom to the future inhabitants by either inserting a air conditioning unit or a random window, that actually it still somehow amplifies the power of the whole structure. So using this knowledge, and this one here, we somehow entered the project, which was also, as you can see, a kind of a vaulted structure, which has another story. It has to do with the tradition of vaulted structures in these latitudes. It has to do with the motive of a staircase from a different origin. It has to do with these provisional housing. It has to do with full and empty, of something that exists or doesn't exist, and about the placemaking. Okay, so this staircase is a principal organizational motive of the house, which actually has a lobby which is stepped in 3 parts, because the whole site is actually pretty steep. So this was a kind of an idea of this public zone, which actually is divided into 3 layers, which are connected together. So you can see them here, and the auditoria, which are somehow inserted, and they alter around this central spine. Okay, so these are the plans, which are maybe not so important at the moment, but somehow this idea that if you make a structure with an arch, then you're doing a kind of a decent building. This is a kind of a popular belief in Croatia, especially in this part called Dalmatia, that if you do this arch, then you are on a good way to this representation. So actually this popular belief, we try to question it, and you can see it all over. And any house owner who wants to build a kind of a rental structure makes these arches to make his house a bit more noble, a bit more interesting for the tourists, which might eventually think that it's old. I don't know which could be the ones that would think that it's old structure. But anyway, even the Gypsies that we met already in Zagreb use these structures to make their shacks more beautiful, but also inserting the picture of the mayor in order not to get the houses demolished. There are very sinister strategies to protect your properties. So we went for this idea how to see the possibility to introduce the arch into architecture today, even though we made a kind of a double-story arches in order to play with the scale. Some of them are mute, some of them are active. So we somehow, actually here we demonstrate the knowledge from the Diocletian Palace. Actually this is the structure and these are the prognomes, but in the course of time they can completely change their radiance. Some of them can become mute and the others can be opened. The house can be completely transformed from the inside out without necessarily making a problem for the overall appearance of the house. This is a kind of a knowledge that we have extracted from the palace, and we firmly believe that this is a reliable way to construct houses in a country with such a programmatic instability as Croatia. Then we also introduced some provisional structures for our interiors. For example, these plastic structures are like little pavilions for the student activities in the lobby. You can see them here in this rendering, how they function within these stepped public zone. You can see them here, and this is the final image, the overall appearance of the structure, which on one hand side you can see the mute arches, the one that have these 3 courtyards with a typical greenery of Mediterranean inside them, and the others who have some other functions. Okay, now we will see a bit more about architecture as educational device, the idea of privacy, generating the public as a subversion. So sometimes you have to maintain some guerrilla tactics to achieve certain goals, otherwise it's not possible. I will illustrate it with an example for the city of Zagreb. It's a project for a kindergarten on a site which is way too small for a kindergarten, which is completely overshadowed by this huge building in the south, next to the very frequented road. So these are the obstacles. We studied the shadows, which somehow affect the site. So what we actually did, we moved this single-story pad structure away from the shadow, but by arriving to the end of the site, we had to fold it. So we had to make a situation like this, to push it out and then to fold it in order to meet the site limits. And what has been designed as a kind of atrium becomes like a kind of a terrace in the vertical altitude. So this is a kind of a mutation of the void from the horizontal into the vertical plane. So this is how so this is again this idea of transformation by folding. And this is the site, sorry. This is the site, as you can see, we use it as much as we can, but then we introduced the fence that went only from here to here in order to leave the fair amount of the site to the public, which needs a kind of a break along this very frequented road, which doesn't offer any sort of relief. So we made kind of a little public part here, simply by using the less attention of the public hand, who didn't notice that we planned the fence like this. So this was the only way how to generate a public space, counting on a weak concentration of the administration. This is the model of the house, showing this idea of internal courtyards, the entrance and the elevation on the north side, the whole disposition of the programs that I'm not going to discuss in the detail now. The model of the whole structure, here you can see these terraces, which originally were the patios, and now transmuted into something else. This is during the construction time. Again, from another side. This idea of long protecting walls and the things which are inscribed into it, like a kind of a protective mat structure, with a multi-purpose room which is also dug into the ground in order to maintain a smooth contour of the building. And then another feature which is very important for our work is this is a kind of inspiration that we are deriving from contemporary art, in this particular case from artists like Dan Graham, where we can see in this fantastic example of his work made for suburban America, where he introduces a mirror in the middle of this house, like a kind of a protection of the zone which is behind the mirror, but scraping off the front parts of the houses, questioning what actually happens behind these thick curtains, and he wants to somehow to reveal these happenings in suburban residential parts and to expose them. So this idea of visibility that he points out so clearly, and which were on display in MoMA 2 years ago, so it was the first time I saw this model later on, we somehow used in order to design a relation between the house and the passers-by, because it's a very frequented path where people go to work every day to the public transport. So we thought that there should be a certain dialogue between the public people and the children in the house. So we somehow designed a kind of a adjustable threshold, which can be maintained by the movable louvers within the glass, so you can tune the level of publicity, of privacy that is appropriated for the kids. And this is how we made it. So we maybe don't see it well, but these are these louvers within the glasses where you can, from the inside, you can decide to which extent the kids can be exposed, because this whole hysteria of pedophiles also came into Croatia. So nowadays you have to be very careful with these things. So this was a kind of a big thing which we somehow resolved by introducing some certain technology to a certain extent. So this is the view from the rear side, highlighting these protected terraces where the kids play where the weather is bad, and also an extra playground on the roof because the site is too small for all the activities that they have in the free areas. So this is the plan of the house, and this is where we come to this idea that the house is treated like an educational device. Actually, all other things that I have mentioned so far are second-rated compared to this, and I think this is the main feature of the project, that actually we have a spine which we call the children's street, where next to the premises of the kids are all the rooms of the people who are employees of the house. So kids, by walking along this kids' street, they can see a woman typing on a machine, they can see a woman cooking, sewing on a machine, they can see a landlord who repairs the furniture, and so on and so on. So they can, this is kind of a simulation of a real city situation where you go along the street and you see a certain shop with a certain profession. So it's kind of a first introduction into the real life, which is also supported by the color codes, which give the kids certain information, but also an aspect of socializing with the people who work there. So I know it from my own experience with my son when he went to the kindergarten that it was a very important idea of relating to the people who work or who work in the kindergarten. So this is the axonometric of this idea of this exchange projects between the grown-ups and the little ones, and this is how it functions in reality. The whole structure is completely transparent, also can be adjusted, of course, with the louvers when necessary when the kids sleep, but otherwise you have always this immediate contact with the people who are employed in the house. This is even our Christmas card back in 2008. This is the view from the outside, from the street, as close as possible. So these are some sections, some other views. From the gardens, there were no trees at the moment when the building was finished. Nowadays it's completely another situation. We even referred to something which has to do with so-called indigo children, so I can't go deeper into it, but it's an interesting phenomenon of nowadays kids. So we somehow inscribe this idea into the very color of the building, hoping that there are some indigos in our house as well. So this is this little public park that we took away from the city, or they giving us to us without knowing. Another view of this whole and this mighty building in front. Okay, so now we come to some other issues, the idea of scalelessness and programmatic stability again. There may be all the projects that I can put this title on, especially dealing with Croatia. But I will explain it with another city. It's the city of Zadar. It's an important city on the coast. This is a so-called Dalmatian coast. It has about 1,000 islands. It's very long. It's very meandering compared to the Italian one, which is completely straight without islands. So it is a coast that people like for the summer, for the holidays. And one of the highlights of this coast, next to the city of Split, is the city of Zadar, with its Roman development in the peninsula, and with some development which belonged to the so-called Yugoslav army in the past. And after this army going away, there was a huge potential, a huge resource of the city, which remained open for some other sources. So the municipality decided to make a new university campus here. And this is our competition entry that we won in 2009, where we are trying to reconcile the modernist slab buildings with these particularized single-family structures from earlier periods. So we try to transport some of each into our site and to make kind of a happy marriage between the two. Also, of course, accompany them with a particular typological compounds. So in these slabs we have dorms and the teaching premises. In these dotted houses we have the little towers for postdocs and guest professors. And in these inclined elements we have the special programs, starting from the cultural center, then the library, then the mensa, and some other activities along these meandering spines. So this is more or less shortly explain the idea of the campus. So we won the competition for the urban design as well as for this library. So it is an idea that we stopped designing houses that have a typological profile. We said we will just design a public house with some nice programs, which has some water, which has some bigger halls, which has some outer feature, which has some gardens. We will make a house that has a sequence of applicable rooms with different radiance and with different qualities. That could be a library that can be transposed into a hotel or a market or a mall or something else, depending on the city, what the city wants. Because the technology of the library changes so quickly that it maybe doesn't make much sense to bind yourself too close to that. By doing the project, I went to Seattle to see the OMA library, and nowadays it's almost obsolete, the technique that has been used there, because the library technology, with all the advancement of electronics, is so fast that almost no building activities can follow that. So, knowing that, we rather went for such an anti-technocratic process, if you want to call it like this. Then, of course, we have some grammar that is usual. We have some outer ring with some services. We have a kind of sloping topography in order to omit the stairs, to have a smooth transition between the levels of the library, because the size of the library permits these smooth transitions. And we have some atria inserted into the structure. So this is the main structure of the house, which you can see here. This is kind of an entrance court with a water feature, and then you enter and then you move along these features, or use this heavy installed perimeter. And this is what I meant when I said scalelessness. We wanted to design a house that has no scale, that you, when you observe it from the outside, that you cannot actually say whether the person is that high or that high, or very small. So we wanted to make a house that has a certain timelessness, a certain scalelessness, that somehow you have to approach it deeper into it to get this information. Because you see it has no windows. All the windows are recessed. They're always on this perpendicular side of this opening in the wall, in order to make a kind of a low-tech sustainable building, which is a very popular concept that we are also using in some other projects. I will show you as a final project our idea of a volcanic low-tech architecture. So this is this entrance courtyard. So you enter it as if you would enter an Islamic narthex, and then you find your entrance and you find your little ramp and you browse around the house. This is the kind of book tower, things like that. And as I said, a collection of typical places that could be used even for other purposes. Necessity of the iconic. That nowadays, as you know very well, it is popular to make icons. Even in this school, which I find it actually good that it's not the main feature of this school to produce icon-prepared making students. So, but even in this school, you can spot certain tendencies towards the iconic. So, the question is whether we do need it or we don't, or when is the possibility to use it. So we dreamt about such a structure, like a hill, like a volcano if you want, that has its own cloud hovering above it. And it was supposed to be a kind of a national stadium for Croatia. And we were thinking about continuity of hills or sport mountains in the city of Zagreb. So starting from this mountain in the back, which serves the skiing activities. It's a world ski series is held here, thanks to the fine athletes that we have in this competition. There is another hill next to the airport, where there is a big depository of garbage, of junk, which became a green hill and a main feature when you enter, when you land in Zagreb. So the question is how to appropriate it with some sporting programs. And then the third one that we are proposing for this national stadium here. The site of the competition is very central. This is the main city spine, and this is the position of the stadium, connected to some premises that I cannot explain in detail now. But somehow we were thinking about this circular accumulation, like this blue mound. The blue is the color of Zagreb, so we went for very straightforward descriptions. So we were thinking, if the shark has its own fish that cleans him, if American president has always the AVAX plane cruising around the city when he is in town, and this was the town when This was the time when President Bush visited Zagreb, so this is where the reference comes from. So why should our hillock have his own cloud telling what the result is of things like that? Maybe it sounds all arbitrary to you, but I will show you that maybe it didn't. So this is the idea of this landmark in the cityscape, coming from the south into the city, where this hovering cloud can even mediate some messages. The skin of the house is made by recycled rubber, painted blue. And this is how it would sit in this landscape, this huge accumulation of this little mass. And if there are some plans that I will not go into detail, but just saying that we are using this slope to enter this intermediate level and then to distribute to go either downstairs or upstairs in order to use the slope of the structure as much as possible. There's even some cable car entering the house. So this is this image of the house that comes from zero and slopes up for all sorts of skateboarding activities or even for some winter activities. So this is the section showing this idea of gradual entering of the house and using these slopes the best way you can. And then something that we are especially proud of is this construction, which actually has no precedence, because these are two rows of cables attached to this main ring. And on these cables we have the polycarbonate domes and membrane PTFE structure. They're all lightweight, and so that there is no such lightweight structure for the stadia in the world. And then it was necessary to close this gap because in the first stage the pitch should remain open. And in the second stage there should be a certain closure for that. So we went for such a solution to make a kind of a free-floating Zeppelin-like structure that we can pull down and close this gap, or either to move it slightly and to have some ventilation, or to let it flow and mediate some messages. So this was the cheapest actually and technically feasible solution to make it. Here you can see this ring and the attachment to the big cloud. From that point of view. And the structure of the house, very straightforward construction, and then the steel construction for this outer skin with corrugated metal and sprayed rubber on the outside, and this roof which I already explained. So it's all lightweight and very cheap and very feasible with the most primitive concrete stands that you can think of. So the competition was in 2011, and after the competition there should have been a kind of a public referendum if they want this blue volcano as the press priced in the project. We never said volcano, so it was a kind of a marketing trick not to use this name, to let them use the name volcano. And since then, nothing happened. So we are still hoping that there is a chance for our volcano to appear, to erupt. But it is not quite probable in a situation where we are now in Croatia. Okay, so this is a farewell image of the project. Oh no, this one, sorry. How it sits in the cityscape seen from the upper town. So I will finish the whole presentation by, as I said, by telling you a bit about how do we feel about sustainability in Croatia and how do we try to interpret it with the low-tech means, which are not always quite low-tech, but somehow we try to keep them as low as possible, and how we eventually make another typological shift when we are dealing with structures like campuses. As an introduction into this, some images that I dug out recently, again in search of additional inspiration. This is a project by Alison and Peter Smithson for their Alexandrina library, where they're also trying to deal with these sustainable issues and how certain elements can be optimized in order to have a better performance of the house. It's all very well written in this book that I cherish and that I somehow reactivated again as a compendium of knowledge and experience. For example, this fantastic mad building which they proposed for Kuwait with these solar chimneys, which are also symbolic in a same way. So they use these verticals as elements which are multi-coded for the ventilation, for the representational purposes. Somehow I wanted to share this impression with a look with you as an introduction to the last project, which is called Park B. It is again about another campus project that we won in 2012. And this is an old structure of university in Zagreb, which has relatively long tradition, starting in the middle of 17th century, with these old houses which were on the hill. In the meantime, we have four campus zones. This is the master plan from the city of Zagreb. This is the river of Sava, the very city center, and the outskirts of the mountains. And this is the position of the campus that we made a competition for. So this is the position. This is the position of the campus in the cityscape. So this is where the center is, and it's relatively well connected with a railway to this again redundant military site, which became accessible in late 90s. So they needed some time to prepare it, but then they made a competition for this 90-hectare site. I don't know how much it is in acres, but you should excuse me for that. 90 hectares, 90,000 square meters of the site. So you can see this distribution of campuses in the city of Zagreb. We have this one in the city, which is almost like the one in Toronto, for example. Then we have the one on the hill that I have shown you in the introduction, and the new one which somehow concludes this idea of connection of a few campus zones in the eastern part of the city. This is our zone with some existing buildings there already. So this is the image of the site. This is the image from World War II with the extensive bombing, because the site was actually the runway for the military, and this is why it was so heavily bombed. The competition brief said, "Give us the future," quite literally. They said, "Give us the future," and somehow we sort of try to believe them. But before we go into the future, we somehow wanted to go a look a bit back in order to take advantage of the project that we are futuristic, especially if we consider this one. I'm really happy that I saw it finally live in the MoMA exhibition last year. It's really still a kind of an impressive, huge model that you are probably familiar with, Broadacre City by Frank Lloyd Wright, where he's sort of arguing that his ideal city, or his landform that he's trying to achieve with this project is a very well structured organism that somehow combines the different typologies and different intensities, different rhythms, different natural features combined with the man-made features in order to arrive to a really hallucinatory project with some equipment that almost is looking into the 22nd century. So it offers a number of inspirations that we also try to reflect upon in our project. This is an inspiration of the local origin, where we are trying to continue this idea from 1947, the idea of green fingers coming from the mountain down to the city, where we're trying to continue this idea along our site next to the river. And even, this is the project site, and even this continuation of this to conclude with this Olympic triangle for the Olympic Games Zagreb 2084. So this is the hope that by that date that Croatia might consolidate. Okay, so another image that we find important for this project is this Banksy graffiti, where there's an option that instead of this parking there should be something more poetic, and we took it as a point of departure of our text that we have used as introductory text, where my colleague said to me that with this text you are not able to win a competition because you are trying to defend them from the very first sentence. But this is actually how it is in Croatia. So it would be wise to take the advantage of this available site, preserve it in the future in a formal public park, at least that. And eventually, if the administration decides and finds some money to build some buildings, then maybe we can do this as well. So this was kind of a idea how to enter the project, and everybody was quite surprised that we won the competition. Normally we are left, we are green, and we are trying to define it in the project. And this is a kind of a continuation of an existing park from the past that we are trying to make as a new park here. And eventually, Koronga is the name of the place. We are trying to make sure that the city has another civic amenity, and if the campus arrives, even better. So these are the layers of the campus with the houses, with some public equipments, with the pathways, with waterways, with atomized infrastructure and so on, all somehow landing together onto the site. The idea of a site is a kind of a continuous process of colonization, starting with the meadow, defining the strips, colonizing the strips with pathways and water, constructing the first cluster until the final saturation of the site. We opted for Crystal Alexander, so this is clear from this diagram, I don't have to describe it, I hope. We opted for kind of a rich mixture of built and unbuilt. We have three clusters, or three flowers, as we said, with clusters here. We have technological startup companies here. We have this public band in the middle, also connected to an existing infrastructure and to the railway in the north, and also to existing parts of the settlements that exist in the vicinity. So these are another image of the layering of the whole site. And this is the master plan of the whole structure. You can see the tramway structure also entering the site and going here further. The big infrastructural hub with a train. The public zone, the public cross that combines, that somehow connects the centers of these flowers, and the very rich landscape in between. So this is an image of this. This is an image from the north, from this hub and this public zone and the development. So it's relatively dense. So this is idea which somehow echoes this Frank Lloyd Wright, Broadacre ideas, that somehow a rich combination which is nowhere the same of different ingredients, the faculties, the areas of air circulation, the areas of woods, the areas of singular residential structures, of waterways, of startup companies, of athletic tracks, of bigger waters, and so on, all somehow bundled together into a kind of a more or less complex unity. The idea of using these waterways to skate in the winter, as the Dutch do in their dikes, or to use the waterways in summer, as they do in England in their campuses. So these are the features that we somehow wanted to use, and this is a typical domestic style. So the idea was actually to equip our flowers, or the sites for the clusters for the university buildings, with the real greenhouses. On one hand side, to maintain the picture of the greenhouse development from the very first day, but by the other hand side, to fight the typical volcanic idea that some parts of the site might be sold in the process or taken away from the campus. So actually, we use the greenhouses as placeholders that nobody can sell them to some private investors or anyone else. So this is kind of a fight against the misuse, and by using the placeholders, and as soon as faculty appears, the greenhouse has been taken away and replaced by another kind of greenhouse that I will show you right now. So urban farming, as you probably know, became quite a phenomenon, also in the meantime, that it happens all over in various intensities with different profiles. So we took advantage of all these things in order to propose a kind of a site which also takes advantage of these greenhouses and everything what is connected with them in order to make urban farming as an integrating factor for our campus. This is the view from the west, where you can see the development, but you can see also something peculiar floating here. And actually we thought that the campus is so big and it's so flat that any building, even if it's 30 or 40 meters high, does not have a certain significance in such a vast distance. That we needed, we felt the necessity to introduce this vertical element, something that goes into this Z coordinate system, that somehow gives the placing or kind of a landmark for this site, but also fulfills a number of other purposes. So we were dreaming of a kind of a floating structure, like a balloon or like an airship, that could somehow be floating over our settlement. And much to our surprise, we found the guys 1 kilometer from the site that produced these things already for meteorological purposes, and even with the very fine subsidies from European Union that you can get for as a support for such pioneering processes. So they produce such airships with engines that make a kind of a positioning of the airship next and navigation by a computer, with some equipment more or less for meteorological purposes. So we approached them, and here you can see them in their lab testing prototypes, which are of course much smaller than the one that we would need for our site. And we wanted these ships to somehow be situated on the site that could fulfill a number of purposes. On one hand side, shading; on the other hand side, light; on the third hand side, they can observe, they can protect from rain, they can make analysis of air and everything else, so they can even serve some purposes that we cannot even think of at the present date, that the future will show us how to use them to a further extent. But somehow they are already possible to be produced today and to be situated along these central axis. Here you see the singular buildings. And this trend of making these floating objects to make shadow became actual by the new World Cup in Qatar, where they have to devise some shading structure for these extreme heats there, or the drones that already became kind of habitual things. DHL fears these robots the most. So these drones that actually are things that is just around the corner, and the technology that we can use almost tomorrow. Now we come to the fact that has to do with sustainability. We are collaborating with a firm in Serbia who has international reputation and works also with other architects as famous as Polvas or Hadid. And they helped us with a number of projects, and of course with this one. They have sophisticated methods such as CFD analysis, computational fluid dynamics. It's a kind of process where you can simulate all the processes around or in the house and see if the measures that you have taken make sense. In this case, the measures that we have taken are primitive, and measuring devices are high-tech. So, the primitive measures are actually the idea that we equip our clusters with greenery. First of all, we make sure that there are gaps of areas which are free of trees, about 10 meters wide, where we can have a free flow of air, throughout the settlement. Then we should make sure that we have the evergreen trees in the south and the trees that lose leaves on everywhere else in order to protect them from the sun. And in the winter, we have these that lose leaves in the south and the evergreens everywhere around. So in the winter, the trees will be no obstacle for the winter sun to go deep into our glass houses. We have also the water purification as one of the elements. Then you see this in this analysis the situation of the houses without the forest and with the forest. So it's a huge difference that you can measure and see that it's really effective and costs less than some other methods. The same goes with the carbon footprint and the noise. We also use the geothermal energy in order to broaden the scope of elements that we are trying to use. We already mentioned the water and this drilling. We use the conventional methods associated with the greenhouse, so we have the faculties as the houses within this big house, and we have the dorms on the north. So combination, again, about this new typology of having them together around in this greenhouse box. And with all these things of insulation and ventilation during the day, in the summer or winter, so these are the things that are not so new, which are, we are simply applying them consistently in our project, as well as to these parts of these slabs which are inserted between the boxes. So this is the situation of simulation of the temperatures within this cluster, with or without measures. And this is a diagram showing actually the whole range of things that we have put in use, and the final outcome, which says that with the heating we are almost covering the complete capacities needed for heating, that we are completely covering the cooling and the bigger part of electricity. So with all these measures applied, we arrived to relatively good numbers. And it must be said that the competition brief was quite strict towards these energy measures, and this is definitely one of the reasons why we won the competition. About the clusters themselves, we have urban rules for them. We equip them with different numbers, that means different densities, different occupational modes. It's important that there are residential use in the north, and there are faculty use in the south, with certain distances that have to be maintained with the rules how to do the heights. So now we are in this very moment entering the first competition for the whole thing, because we finished the regulation plan for the whole site. So now the first houses have to be applied for. Here you see the structures. So actually it's a kind of a slightly different educational concept, where you have these official lecture halls with all the premises needed, but also this area in between, which is an extra space which is not heated, which is somehow this intermediate climate between the outer glass and the inner glass. So it will be a kind of an experiment, not only from the point of view of energy consumption, but also in the point of view of how to use these intermediate spaces, not only in terms of having a kind of a simulation of a city situation, like a square and street, but also in terms of educational possibilities. Okay, so this is the profile of the house, where you can see also these residential parts. So this is the view, one of these residential towers towards these lower productive parts, even the cutout atrias. Okay. So this is the view from this airship towards down, seeing these river flows and stripes without greenery for the air propulsion. So this is a zoom of the project showing that this external zone somehow amplifies the use of the internal zone in different ways. You can even bicycle through the house, so the house actually becomes a kind of a propulsive device where people can burn. So this is one of the images of this structures which is inserted into this greenhouse structure. And this is the final image from the exhibition where the airship was hovering above these the place with the projects, so somehow testifying that this future has already arrived, that it's not simply around the corner, that it has already arrived here. For the end, there are some books that you might be interested in. There is one collaboration with some other offices made by Zadar in Barcelona. There is a little monograph that we also made in Spain, and there is another book that we are preparing for Italy right now. And if you would like to know more, you are very welcome to visit our website. Thank you very much. So if you have, I'm sorry if it was a bit too long, but if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Does anyone have questions they would like to ask? Actually, I have one.
Okay, please.
You mentioned programmatic instability during several school projects. Could you elaborate on what that means to you?
I think that it actually has different reasons why we tackle this thing. On one hand side, the advancement of technology somehow changes the problem so quickly. And by this project of library, we became witness of such a huge shifts in technology, in use of the space, and all things connected with books, that we simply are not in a position to design a structure that can follow it without a problem. So we have to find ways how to deal with that, how to relativize that. On the other hand side, there is a certain lack of responsibility in programming these educational buildings, which is probably not the case in the States, but in such a country as Croatia, it's definitely the case that some ambitions are projected into space without maybe enough backing or argumentation. And if we simply follow them as architects, we might come completely astray and not hitting the target that we wanted. So this is the second reason why we think that we really need to go for structures which have a higher level of flexibility, which do not take care about the technology at all, or that could be transformed into something else. As you can see in this last project, that this is this greenhouse concept with these inserted lamellas, which can be even interpreted in some other ways. So we should somehow try to define the levels of the project where we can make alterations as good as possible.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.